So, have I mentioned that I like Japan? Okay, I know I don't shut up about the land of the rising sun, but it was a big thing for me and involved a lot of time spent reflecting on Japanese culture. Of course, the class I took was actually a film course, but I naturally love to read, and so assimilated a lot of books relating to the country. Now, I openly admit that none of these are actually Japanese novels, but rather English-language books that focus on Westerners visiting the country. Well, a couple of the non-fictions are from Japan, but there's only a couple of those. If I get around to reading more Japanese novels, I may make a video about it. Of course, I may have to post it in Nihonji! First, I'll start off with the non-fiction. The first book I had to read was for my film class, and it was called Something Like an Autobiography, but just like all the old Toho films, it had two titles. It was originally called An Oily Toad. It was the autobiography of a filmmaker named Akira Kurosawa. You might have heard of him, directed a couple of legendary films, a lot of the past century was based on his work. I don't know, maybe my teacher was a hipster, but the book was awesome as one of his films. It literally starts from the day he was born and goes up to the making of his first big film called Rashomon. He relates many stories of his youth, including a very powerful one about the Great Kanto earthquake. This was a huge earthquake back in the 1920s which decimated Tokyo and killed hundreds of people. He tells of how he and his brother went up to the river and it was coated with bodies and the river was running red. My buddy Dylan quoted this part in class. If you shut your eyes to a frightening sight, you end up being frightened. If you look at everything straight on, there is nothing to be afraid of. Incidentally, I actually saw footage of the earthquake when I was in Tokyo. I highly recommend this book. If you can get your hands on it, read it. I also read Geisha, A Life by Mineko Iwasaki. As the title implies, this was the story of a geisha who lived in Kyoto back in the 60s and 70s. It was a very moving tale about her life and how she was brought up. It got a lot of hell because she revealed some of the secret things of the geisha, but even so, I felt it was a personal enough story to check out. I also read its fictional counterpart, Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden, which got a lot of hell for inaccurately portraying geisha life as cruel and abusive. Iwasaki was actually the model for the fictional character and partly wrote her book to dispel the wrong ideas that Golden put forth in his book. Poor lady, she supposedly received death threats because of it. Geisha don't mess around. If you ever read the book or saw the movie, yeah, none of that's true. It's a bunch of fiction construed to make the plot more adaptable to Western audiences. Here's the thing. It's not real. Okay? It didn't really happen. I actually liked the book quite a bit. It kind of reminded me of Gone with the Wind and how the story plays out. It was interesting in how it was written, with a very formal and simplistic style that actually read like a real translation. The book is supposed to be like a fictional translation of like a real memoir. It's weird. However, I found it could sit right next to Kurosawa and Iwasaki and read much the same. Strange how he captured something that specific. If I had to recommend one over the other, I'd say go with the non-fiction one, but if you have the time, check them both out. They're worth it. Okay, time for something a little more hardcore. Tokyo Underworld by Robert Whiting. This was published back in 1999 after the Japan craze of the 80s was dying down and giving way to more accurate depictions of the country. For years, this was the foremost authority on the famous Japanese gangsters, the Yakuza. Whiting delves into the history of the Yakuza, how they started back in the samurai days and really came into their own in the A-bomb slums of Hiroshima after the war. He goes on telling how they grew and became one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates in the world. And of course, he told of many missing fingertips. The book is okay. It does drag in some sections when he starts talking about more legitimate Japanese history, like how they almost took over the world with their electronic corporations, but it picks right back up when he delves into the tattooed world of gambling outlaws. Following on that, there was a book called Tokyo Vice by a guy named Jake Adelstein, an American journalist who worked in the police units in Tokyo. He recounts many criminal investigations that he was a part of, covering thieves, murderers, serial killers, pimps, prostitutes, and of course the Yakuza, getting embroiled in a large real-life conspiracy that puts the movies to shame. Truth is stranger than fiction. It also gets really disturbing in some parts, made all the more worse because it's supposedly true. It does kind of drag in some other parts, but if you've got the time, look into it. It's not for the squeamish. What's more hardcore than the Yakuza? Samurai. Oh yeah! I read a book of philosophy by a real Ronin samurai named Miyamoto Musashi called The Book of the Five Rings. It tells of numerous battle positions and how to conduct yourself in sword fighting. It's also used as a meditative book, analyzing how to strike at your opponents mentally in more civilized settings. If you call business meetings civilized. My edition also came with Family Traditions on the Art of War by Yagu Minonore, again a military treatise that can be applied to modern, peaceable contexts. As a side note, I also read Sun Tzu's Art of War, a little more famous Chinese edition of the same basic philosophy. If I can get Machiavelli, I'll have the whole set. But okay, this is all well and good, but let's get down to the real stuff. The sexy books. Works of fiction. So I already reviewed this one, but I'll mention it again. You Only Live Twice by Ian Fleming. James Bond's trip to Japan, where he meets villains, heroes, ninjas, half-naked ladies with terrible names, and of course, living lobster sushi. I tried to find some of that legendary food while I was over there, but I came up short. Oh well, if you want a more in-depth review, check out my James Bond Bonanza-thon. I read Michael Crichton's Rising Sun, a novel about how Japan was invading America in the 1980s and subsequently the 90s. The book is okay. It works as a simple mystery thriller mixed in with a lot of Japanese culture, but then Crichton goes on these paranoid rambles about how Japan is taking over the world, how we're selling the US to the Japanese, how irresponsible we are for allowing this to happen, blah, blah, blah. It's almost the exact same crap you hear about China today, and how America is about to be owned by the Chinese. Well, it didn't happen then, it ain't gonna happen now. It's hilarious to see that people actually thought like that, like educated people who use all these legitimate sources for confirmation bias. Or maybe not. Maybe it was Crichton's book that averted the Japanese disaster. Still, it's worth a read, if for nothing else than as a cultural capsule of the late 80s. And it makes a reference to a Kurosawa film. Gotta love that. But back before Japan was the biggest thing in America in the 80s, there was Eric Van Lustbader's Ninja. It sucked. I couldn't even finish this one. It just wasn't my cup of tea. I got maybe 100 pages into it before I had to just set it down. I mean, when it got going, it was pretty good. They had brutal killings and things and some graphic sex scenes, which I don't really mind so much. I guess I'm still in that teenage boy mentality. But there was so much boring crap in between that I couldn't stand it. I mean, I kept thinking it had some kind of deep plot about Japanese culture or something, but no. According to Wikipedia, it's just a generic light ninja, dark ninja revenge plot. In fact, not even like real ninjas. They're just idiots who studied ninjutsu after watching You Only Live Twice. My copy ran 450 pages, with tiny-ass print, I might add. There is nothing you need to say in 450 pages. What's really weird is that this spawned a whole series going on for 7 books now. Who the hell is the audience for this? Another book I read was called Shinju by Laura Jo Rowland, which is actually a Korean name. This one was interesting. It's basically a samurai cop murder mystery. Think CSI Ito. It's the first in a series about a samurai named Sano Ichiro who goes around and has to solve crimes in medieval Japan. It's as silly as it sounds, but it's unpretentious and well written enough to warrant looking into. I actually came across this one by accident, seeing it in the bookstore and not really knowing what the hell it was. If I wasn't doing this project, I probably wouldn't have given it a second glance, but still, it was worth my time. Unlike some books I've mentioned. On the comic book side of things, I looked into Frank Miller's graphic novel Ronin, about a renegade samurai reborn into a dark, futuristic New York. Yeah, this was the epitome of the 80s. Cyberpunk Japanese crap. Again, I couldn't really finish this one, but I also tried reading it in the middle of my school semester. It just didn't work out, I don't know. I might give it another shot one day, but for now, I'm content to let sleeping cyberpunks lie. I did manage to read Miller's Wolverine series from just before this, where the old knucklehead travels back to Japan, ruminates on how he was a samurai back in the day, and has to save his girlfriend from an army of ninjas. They originally made a movie out of it. It's at least worth a look. David Mitchell wrote the book Cloud Atlas, which I reviewed in my Psychotronic Sci-Fi series. It has a sequence of it that takes place in a dark and futuristic Korea, which parallels many Japanese anime series, so I figured he had to know something about anime. Little did I realize he lived in the land of the rising sun for 8 years and spoke fluent Nihonji, even marrying a Japanese lady. He's actually written several novels that take place in Japan, like Ghost Written and 1,000 Autumns of Jacob D. Zoet, but the one I managed to get my claws on was called Number 9 Dream. It came as a recommendation from my buddy who was reading it while we were over there, and it was a masterpiece. It details the coming of age of a country boy moving into the big city in a quest to find his father. And by the big city, I mean the all-time biggest. Tokyo! The book is divided into 8 parts, each one built around a different theme. One shows him daydreaming and getting lost in the worlds of fantasy, another shows him reading a book with talking rabbits that parallels his own life, and one even focuses on video games. I loved this book, and if there was any doubt in my mind that David Mitchell is a genius, this dispelled it. It had action, adventure, romance, horror, the Yakuza, and things that I happened to see while I was over there. All it needed was a samurai. Does anyone remember the movie Sayonara with Marlon Brando? No? Well, neither do I. But I do remember the book it was based on. Written by James Michener, who would later go on to write huge novels about places all around the world, Sayonara tells of the forbidden love between an Air Force pilot and a Japanese lady at the end of the American occupation. Well, it's actually during the Korean War, but who cares about that? It was okay. It's really a generic forbidden romance thing, and I didn't find it all that moving. It really didn't have a lot of Japanese culture and society. I mean, it had a little, but that wasn't the focus. It was more about American attitudes towards the Japanese and really other countries and how unaccepting they were back in the 50s. Remember, this was back when civil rights were in style and it was rebellious to say that Asians were humans too. Nothing wrong with a little white guilt. But okay, I've just been building up to it, to the big one, the one that started it all. James Clavell's Shogun. I actually read this one while I was over there. Actually, I only read half of it. By the time I got back, I was only 570 pages into it. It's the story of the first Englishman who penetrated into Japan and was actually appointed to be a samurai. But really, it's more about the shogun lords of Japan and how they took power. It's a massive, sprawling epic showing all of feudal Japan from the bums on the streets to the high palaces of the emperor's court. There's even ninjas. It's a fictionalized account of the rise of the Tokugawa family to power, of course changed a little so Westerners can relate to it better. I think it's a little more relatable than Clavell's other works like Taipan and Noble House because it has that sense of discovery with a fish out of water. It was, of course, made into a TV movie starring one of Japan's most famous actors, Toshiro Mifune, in the role of the all-powerful Toranaga samurai lord. In short, it was another day at the office for him. Clavell also wrote a book called Gaijin, which is a Japanese word for foreigner, which tells the end of the samurai days and the coming of Westerners. More white guilt! I only had time to read 1,000-page long book, so I had to skip the second one. However, I'm told it's basically The Last Samurai, but a little more political. If you really want to, dive right in. Okay, I hope this was a good overview of Japan viewed through Western eyes. If I have the chance to read more, I might get around to it. So for now, sayonara!